First of all, thanks to the organizers for organizing this event, which is actually very exciting. So today I'm going to discuss a little bit about properties of those carbines in interaction with sp2 carbon, which is basically graphene. So these carbines are sp carbon chains, and we've done this work in collaboration with our experimental group in Milan, a group led by Paolo Milani. So the experimental group are actually synthesizing and characterizing those compounds, and the theoretical team involves Giovanni Onida and some students or former students of ours. So in carbon, one has the standards sp3, sp2, and sp hybridizations, which in, say, the chemist's world would be implemented, for example, in ethane, ethylene, and acetylene, respectively. And in the solid state, they would be realized as a diamond for the sp3 situation and graphene, of which we heard quite a lot in these days. And of course, there are also intermediate possibilities, like, for example, the fullerenes and the nanotubes, which will be somewhere intermediate in between sp3 and and sp2. However, sp is somehow a more exotic situation, and in the solid state, one could only imagine things like carbon chain, one-dimensional carbon chains of this sort, which could have either alternating single, triple bonds or double bonds, possibly. And this would be, say, carbines, objects that in general one would call carbines. In fact, they can be synthesized. They have been synthesized chemically, and say the trick, the necessity to get them synthesized in the lab is to have the ends of those molecules somehow saturated, because otherwise the dangling bonds would be extremely reactive, and those things will immediately dissociate. So basically, one can have a saturation with a single hydrogen at the end, and this ending will immediately induce an alternating triple-single bonding. Or otherwise, one can have a saturation with two hydrogens at the ends, that is sp2 carbon here, and in this way, one will get all double bonds. So this would be what is called polines, and this is cumulants. Of course, one can end those molecules with all different terminations, like copper, for example, or complicated organic compounds. But the main thing is that these are not pure carbon systems. It's just really complicated compounds. So in the quest for pure sp carbon, this Milani group has been carrying out a long research. In fact, something was already present in the literature. For example, mass spectrometry showed that the dimers of fullerene C60 can be bound by carbon chains. So this would be a carbon-only compound with an sp chain in between. However, this is sort of a rather indirect evidence to mass spectrometry, but then later there came direct experiments with transmission electron microscopy, where graphene sheets were stretched, and as a result of this stretching, they got thinner and thinner under the electron microscope, until eventually leading to single carbon chains, monatomic carbon chains that under the electron flux could even perform some hoppings along the chain, along the graphene edge, as happens here. So there are two different experiments which were both published in 2009 with very careful microscopy conditions. Also this group by Milani was also in search for some clear evidence of carbenic objects in their samples. So the idea is that once one has some carbon sample, for example, graphitic sample, if one makes it more disordered by, for example, bombardment with xenon ions, the result is that the the Raman spectrum, which in pure graphite will have this D and G band, will eventually modify and form a sort of a lamp in the region between 1200 and 1600 centimeters to the minus 1. However, in these samples produced by the chemists, where there are chemically stabilized sp chains, one observes another peak in a completely different positions around about 2000 centimeters to the minus 1. So apparently this so-called C band is the signature of the stretching modes of those carbines, which have those strong threefold bonds, which will vibrate at a higher frequency. So the group in Milan has developed a technique to deposit carbon samples, and the idea is based on, say, creating a plasma discharge against a carbon graphite rod, and then having the clusters which are eroded away from this carbon surface thermalize in the gas at a rather cold temperature, and then be ejected in a supersonic beam and deposited on a substrate, which could be glass or silicon or silica, whatever. So this carbon material is constructed by the aggregation of clusters, which are rather cold, and as a result, they form a nanostructured structure of the material. And indeed, in the Raman characterization of those spectra, they could see some peak here at around 2000 centimeters to the minus 1, which they were inclined to interpret in terms of these SP chains. So they carried out further investigation starting from about 2002, and they discovered that if they could run in situ experiments rather than taking the sample out into air, this C band, the so-called C band, is actually is much stronger than otherwise. So the idea was that indeed those carbon chains are produced by this technique, and they are actually unstable and difficult to maintain when they are exposed to atmospheric conditions. So just to give you a little bit an idea of what must be going on in the production of those chains, I ran a simulation with the tight binding molecular dynamics. This is, say, some 7 picoseconds of simulation ran at a rather high temperature. We will be simulating the conditions in this plasma. And you see that some atoms get eroded away, that they form some single atoms, some dimers moving around, and also occasionally some longer carbon chains, as will happen here at the end. This will detach from the rest of this otherwise sp2 structure. So this would be an example of many that we ran a simulation of the formation of those carbon chains as is done in this plasma source that I showed you. Okay, let's go back to experiment. In fact, in experiment, now it froze somehow. Okay, so in experiment, they analyzed in greater detail this peak, this C band at about 2000 centimeters to the minus 1, and basically we recognize several different features inside, and in fact all those components, when they are exposed to gas, they tend to somehow decay in intensity, and also to blue shift and move a little bit, and also get a little bit narrower. So apparently there must be some reaction, something going on about those carbon chains when exposed to gases. So we come back to this experimental data at the end of my talk, and in between I'll just try to to present you a little bit what kind of calculations we've done and what kind of structural analysis and so on. So as in the previous talk, we are using ab initio calculation with density functional, the same quantum espresso package. We're actually using the LSDA because in fact, we are mostly interested in bonding and chemical changes. So the van der Waals interactions are not especially necessary for what we are interested in here. So these are standard methods for the calculation of the electronic structure. Then we can do also structural relaxation to compute the fully relaxed structures. And we also can compute vibrational frequencies that we can compare to Raman spectra in terms of this density functional perturbation theory. So first of all, we evaluated the interaction of those carbon chains in different chemical situations when binding to different sorts of compounds. For example, small fullerenes, like here, where there is a binding to an sp3 site, to graphene on the sides of the graphene surface, on top of the graphene surface, where binding would be not particularly well favored, and also to graphenic edges, like here, where indeed the binding energy would be much stronger. So typically, say in optimal conditions, we have that the creation of the bonding between the chain and some sp2 edge will gain an energy of about 6 or so electron volts per bonding. So to describe what's going on in this nanostructured carbon which is deposited in those experiments, we try to invent some model. For example, we imagine to take a graphene sheet, to dig a hole inside, and to put one of those carbon chains inside. Except that when we made those holes rather small, as in this model, eventually, very quickly, the chain will relax and form extra bonding at the edges, so very little of the chain will remain here. So also in this case, with this small lozenge-shaped hole, eventually the chain will relax and get shorter. So eventually we had to resort to a hole of this quite big size and put chains either joining those two zigzag edges or those lateral armchair edges as here. So of course a carbon chain does not have a comparable lattice spacing to the one of the graphene sheet. So as a result, one is left with some kind of strain. For example, if this is a C6 chain as here, this would be under tensile strain. Instead, if one tries to fit in a C8 or a C6 or a C7 chain, they will be under compression, and as a result, the relaxed structure will be a bent structure as here. So we confirm the same kind of results that I quoted before. The stabilization energy when joining a chain to an edge, to each of the edges, is about 6 electron volts, and those chains are indeed quite well stabilized under those conditions. So this would be a confirmation that indeed we can expect that in a carbon-only sample, those chains are indeed stable and they should remain for quite a long time, unless there are external perturbations, of course. So indeed, we simulated what will happen if a chain is subject to hot conditions, and how long will remain stable in this carbon-only situation. So we ran then molecular dynamics, and again, we did not use the FTS LSDA in a Carr-Parinello technique that would be too expensive, so we just switched to this tight binding, simpler electronic structure. And we observed many kinds of features like edge walking, detachment from one end, chain merging into the graphene edge, or chain breaking at some intermediate point. So let's see a few little movies illustrating those different points. So you see that here you see some example of edge walking, very similar to the one that we've seen in the experiment, the TAM experiment by Shuvlin, and which indeed shows that the chain can detach and then reattach somewhere else. Or we can also see, okay, again, it's somehow freezing. Okay. Or there can also happen that in those thermal processes, the chain will move and then merge up to the edge and form extra sp3 carbon, like in this situation here. And then, otherwise, there can also happen a situation where the chain breaks at some intermediate point. But notice that all those simulations are carried out at quite high temperatures, like, say, 4,000 K. So indeed, one can estimate the lifetime of those chains. My idea was just to take the length of the longest bond along the chain, which would be around 2 or 3 angstroms for a long time, until at a certain time the chain snaps. Okay? So this would be the time at which the chain snaps. And this time will depend on the temperature of the simulation, and typically will tend to increase by decreasing the temperature of the simulation. So the thing will be more and more stable as the simulation is run at a colder and colder time. So we plotted those times as a function of temperature. Each of those points is an average over many simulations. And so we plot them in this Arrhenius plot with the result that indeed we have this Arrhenius law with this activation energy, which is basically the snapping energy of those chains. And indeed, this is compatible when we extrapolate this to room temperature, or to 1000 K even, to a snapping time of several hours. So basically, those chains, even at 1000 K, should be fairly stable, even for a few hours. They should be quite stable. Indeed, the interaction with gases, with oxygen, for example, is a different story. This was carbon only, and indeed there was some simulation of this situation by the group of Mosler, who published a couple of works to which I attract your attention. So let's now go to more electronic properties. So indeed, those DFT calculations give us all wave functions of electrons. And so in particular, we basically get 3 kinds of possible wave functions. We get, say, wave functions which are fully localized on the carbon chain. We get hybrid wave function, which mix states of the carbon chain and of the graphene edge. And then we can get also bulk states. Sometimes they are hybridized with the chain, and sometimes they are really pure bulk states inside the graphene. And also we get some states which are localized only on the nanohole edge. Okay? So we use a different color codes for those states. The blue ones are those are localized in the chain, and the pink ones are those which are localized at the edge. So we can plot the band structure. So this would be the path in the Brillouin zone of corresponding to the periodic box surrounding this area here, the 2D periodic box surrounding here. So this would be a very small Brillouin zone compared to the one of graphene, for example. And so here we are zooming in the region near the Fermi level, which is 0 here. And you see that the levels which cross the Fermi level, the bands which cross the Fermi level do not involve the chain. For example, this blue level, this blue band is a chain band, and it's very far away from the Fermi level. At the Fermi level, there are bands, these green ones, which are bulk bands of the graphene, and also those pink levels here, which are those describing the graphene edge. So this means that at the graphene edge, you have those states very near to the Fermi levels. This is a spin majority. For the spin minority, they move up, so they are basically not occupied. So this suggests that there is some magnetism in this system, because indeed you have a different occupation of those edge states. If you have odd chains instead, like C7, then in that case, you also get some state of this blue band here, which is crossed by the Fermi level. So an odd band, an odd chain would also be metallic in a way, but even chains would be insulating. So indeed, we do have a magnetic structure. So the the dangling bonds of the graphene edge indeed do carry some magnetization. The magnetic ground state will be the one where atoms of different sublattice have opposite spin polarization. This red and gray will be clouds containing the positively and negatively magnetized spin density. Of course, this is the ground state, but there are also magnetic excitations where some of the spins flip, and so they frustrate the tendency of magnetic order. And for example, this will be a situation where this spin, for example, has flipped and a few others have. So you see that these magnetic excitations will have a very small energy, so they are just, one can invent, if you want, a spin-only model to describe them. So this will be other magnetic excitations, and those can be described in terms of some J interaction, describing the coupling between spins at different edge states. But of course, it's not particularly important to see it in very much detail, because anyway, this specific hole is just one that we invented ourselves. I mean, there could be other holes with different magnetic structure, so it's not an especially important thing. The only, say, thing which is worth remembering is that a graphene edge or a graphene hole is likely to have some kind of anti-ferromagnetic order of the dangling bonds inside. So indeed, there will be some magnetism there. The chain tends to be not magnetic, except for the odd case. So this is a C7 chain, and this will also carry a little bit of magnetism, but not the even chains. Okay, let's go back to experiments, to vibrational spectra. So indeed, we could compute the vibrational spectra of the chains. We also computed them in the case where the chains were bound to fullerenes, to other structure, to graphene nanoribbons, and all different possible configurations. So whenever we had the chain completely relaxed, we got frequencies, vibrational frequencies, which were very much in agreement to the experimental ones, around 2,000 centimeters to the -1. Instead, in a situation like this, where the chain is bound to this nano hole, we know that it is actually in a tensile situation, and as a result, all frequencies get lower. For example, here, the strongest Raman mode, which is called the alpha mode, is at slightly less than 1900 centimeters to -1. So the idea is that we do expect some kind of softening due to strain. Indeed, chains, when they get deposited on those carbon samples in those experiments, will eventually be somehow strained to some not comfortable positions. So as a result, we do expect that all vibrations should be slightly red-shifted. But then, remember what happened in the experiment. As soon as one sent some gases into the sample, all peaks which were observed inside, say, the experimental structure tended to blue shift and also to get narrower and less intense. So our idea of what happens here is that the reaction with those gases which are sent into the vacuum chamber tend to first of all, get rid of many of those chains. Many of those chains will be able to just reconvert into sp2 carbon and just go away, or to have some of them relax, especially those with higher tension just get detached and get relaxed in a way that eventually all frequencies get slightly blue shifted, and also narrower. Those peaks get narrower due to the fact that there is less dispersion. The existence of different peaks, instead, we attribute to chains of different lengths. So those different lengths of chains will have indeed different frequencies, and in particular, the shortest chains will have the highest frequency, and the longer the chains, the smaller the frequency. So this would be like C8 or C10, for example. Okay, indeed, also experimentally, the conductance of the sample tends to decay as it gets exposed. And indeed, this might be connected to the fact that all the chains, which are the ones which could be conducting, tend to decay faster than even chains. Okay, so to conclude, we have investigated in quite some detail what happens when those sp chains get connected to sp carbon. Indeed, the sp carbon is pretty much capable to stabilize them at least as well as the chemical endings like hydrogen or sp2 carbon. So we have cooked up this simple model for an sp-sp3 combined. Of course, this is just a model. We don't expect there is exactly that specific hole. There could be a very much more complicated situation, but it just gives an idea of what can be going on in these samples. Indeed, the calculations confirm thermodynamical stability of those chains, which can be kept as long as they're in vacuum. They can be kept for weeks, and they remain stable. We also have simulated the high temperature conversion, which I already showed you a little bit of movies. In general, graphene gives a metallic character to the sample, but the chains contribute to metallicity only for the odd case. And the holes, and in general, the edges of graphene will have magnetic states attached. Mechanical strain of those chains will tend to generally lower vibrational frequencies, and as a result, this can account for the blue shift, which is observed in experiment upon gas interaction. So these are just a few works for those who would like to go into more detail of what we've done about carbines, and thank you for your attention.